Well, 3 more rounds have gone. It's the end of the 9th, and the game's over. Pretty busy map. Well done, the Federation. Let's take a look. Yep, now they've got their 5 ascendancies, and no one else was able to get to 5 this turn. But as often the case, the others were pretty close. In fact, all 3 of the other races got 4 ascendancies and 0 culture tokens, so they're all exactly equal in terms of ascendancy and culture, which is quite funny after 9 rounds of intense play. So it was an unusual game in that there was no wars at all and no hegemony at all. Very unusual. Was that just because I was playing solo and that's the way it panned out? Well, I don't think any of the factions really had a major excuse to attack any of the others. Like, the Federation got there by running a whole lot of... There's 3 culture there, 1, 2, 3, discovering 3 phenomenons in a row. And I thought for a while I must have forgotten to shuffle the phenomenons in because there was very few at the start of the game. But then a lot more planets came out as well, so yeah, no, I didn't. But the Federation picked up 3 there, and even though they only had 2 culture nodes, how could they win with only 2? Well, they used the colonization fleet, which has been turned over, but that's the one where you can create a colony without having to spend a culture. So most of their colonies did not require a culture. And because they only built 2 culture nodes, and the culture node takes 2 culture itself, there was very little expenditure there. So with the 4, 5 phenomenons and 5 phenomenons and civilizations that they discovered, that's a whole ascendancy. And 2 per turn, 9 turns, bang. And they snuck in. The other thing about this game was that the shields were very, very high, and weapons, because we had those 2 allies floating around from person to person every turn. And this is probably why the Andorians didn't quite get there. Because although the Andorians have got sort of reason to be aggressive, because they capture and get research if they kill an enemy unit, an enemy ship, so it sort of encourages them to attack. And also, they're encouraged to get higher weapons and shield development because they get culture if they've got it. And they tried real hard. But the luck of the draw, as you can see, they had like 8 research nodes, which is fantastic. But they only had 1, 2, 3, 4, 5 production nodes. So they're not getting much production. These guys over here are getting 20 production a turn, and these guys are getting 5 and 2 for the agreement with the Terrans, because they were never able to join up to the Ferengi. So they didn't get an opportunity to trade with the Ferengi. They didn't even get an opportunity to trade with the Romulans across the middle of the table, because there's just no joining up. And I did try pretty hard, not just by the Andorians, but with others as well. So what that meant was, although the Andorians had truckloads of research, which in theory should have catapulted them into the lead for culture, because they should have been higher than anyone else at shields and weapons, because of those allies floating around, the others were able to cash their superior production, and they were all trading with each other, the other players, to make shields and weapons. So the Andorians never got to get ahead. And because of low production, they never were able to build up a big fleet. In fact, they were quite weak. And it was just the fact that the Ferengi and the Terrans didn't see any point in attacking them that saved them, because otherwise they were pretty weak. Because they didn't have enough production to be able to buy lots of ships to go on the offensive. Not until sort of the very late game. But even now, they're not getting much production. So, yeah. Second equal amongst those. And coming around here to the Romulans. They just slid in, stole that second equal base. They just managed to get the fourth ascendancy this turn, because they managed to get a couple of these advances completed, and those advances win them an extra production, an extra culture. So that, on top of the fact that they had 4 culture nodes, meant that they got a lot of culture in the late game. But they too were a little bit disadvantaged, in that they got a good trade agreement with the Federation. And the Ferengi also favoured the Federation for trade, because they got a trade fleet into the Federation first, and that did make a difference to their production in the Federation. So these guys just sort of sat there, pretty mediocre, not doing badly, but just not really getting enough to get anywhere. They've got a whole lot more building, so there's more culture there, but too late, And again, they didn't really get the opportunity to attack, and partly because both the Ferengi and the Federation that the Romulans were in touch with, or in physical contact with, both had really high shields and weapons, and higher so than the Romulans. So for the Romulans to attack, they would have required a much heavier force, which they just didn't have. And looking last at the Ferengi and their tight little empire there, I mean, they were pretty fortunate to get these planets. Well, they're getting something like 22 production a turn, and over the last couple of turns, they just, because they were pretty strong in shields and they had, reasonable fleets, and so they weren't easily going to be attackable. And the Andorians couldn't get to them. The Federation, the Ferengi thought that they wouldn't really bother, and of course they didn't, because the Federation was doing too well out of it and was probably just ahead and knew that, and so didn't want to upset the apple cart. And yeah, they weren't too afraid of the Romulans either, because they knew the Romulans were not really that powerful. But again, very high shields and weapons. And yeah, and lots of production, and enough research to keep them in the game. And of course they were milking these two here every turn, and in the latter game started to milk this one as well, because with 3 shields you can just take it off the 4 hazard every turn. So yeah, an unusual game for a number of reasons. The other thing I'd point out is none of the races are overly aggressive. The Andorians and the Romulans can be aggressors, but they're not, the Andorians can be pretty powerful, but they never got off the starting block, because they couldn't earn enough production to build enough ships at the same time that they were trying to get ahead with research, like I said. So again, I mean, this is I don't normally play this one solo because I've got a group I play it with. But that was a lot of fun to do that solo and just to see how it played out. And I think going forward, I need to introduce a couple more of the other races that I haven't actually played yet, like the Breen will probably be next, and then the Vulcans after them, and then the Borg. So that's a sign off from Star Trek Ascendancy.